Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us at this EU side event at COP26 on climate impacts as drivers of displacement. I'm Claudio Rosmino, and I have the honor to moderate this session, jointly organized by the European Commission Joint Research Center, the European Commission Directorate General for International Partnership, the United Nations Refugee Agency, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Our speakers, connected from Europe and Africa, will help us to get an accurate perception of climate change-related migration, a key phenomenon of our times. We will hear contributions from scientists, human rights operators, and policymakers. So let me briefly introduce my guests. Fabrizio Natale, Senior Scientist at the Joint Research Center. Sophie von Leuben, Scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. From Pretoria, Angèle Dikongue Atangana, Deputy Director for the Regional Bureau of UNHCR in Southern Africa. Bina Desai, Head of Programs at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Cecilia Jimenez Damari, Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons at Human Rights Council. And Chiara Adamo, Acting Director for Human Development, Migration, Governance, and Peace Directorate in DG International Cooperation and Development in the European Commission. Welcome to you all, and thanks for being here today. So let's officially open this session with a video message from Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. She will underline the human rights impact that are being felt where migration is driven or influenced by climate change, and the need to put the human rights of migrants at the center of policy responses. Let's have a listen.
Thank you for joining us for today's event, which my office is pleased to co-sponsor with the European Union and other partners. The recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is clear. The ecosystems in which we build our lives and our livelihoods are changing at an unprecedented rate. Climate change is already severely affecting a number of human rights, including to food, health, water, and sanitation, education, and decent work, and even the right to life. Throughout human history, individuals, families, and communities have used migration as a strategy for adapting to changing environmental conditions. But a rapidly heating climate requires new solutions to ensure that such migration is a choice and not a necessity. With that in mind, my office is launching the first report of our new research and capacity building project on human rights, climate change, and migration in the Sahel, a region where the severe climate crisis is already driving migration decisions. Its impacts are changing the manner in which people have been accustomed to migrating and increasing migrants' exposure to vulnerable situations in transit and at destinations. There is an urgent need for human rights-based, community-led adaptation and mitigation measures in the Sahel, including pathways that enable regular migration as a climate change adaptation strategy. It is clear that when human rights are affected by climate change, states have an obligation to act both individually and in cooperation to either prevent harm when they can or to remedy it when they can. Although each state and region experiences climate change in its own way, some of what we observe in the Sahel is true worldwide. This is an emergency with human rights impacts everywhere, often most affecting those least responsible and influencing where and how people migrate. Basic principles of justice and equity require that those countries which have contributed the most to climate change support countries most affected, like those in the Sahel, to deploy the policies, resources, and technologies they need to mitigate and adapt to this crisis. Effective climate solutions empower the people most affected and meaningfully reflect their views, perspective, and active participation. I hope that today's conversation will contribute to advancing evidence-based, inclusive, and people-centered approaches to climate change-related migration. My office stands ready to continue working with states and other stakeholders in developing, enacting, and implementing such policies. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, High Commissioner. Before introducing our first speaker, let me remind you that you can send your question to our guests. How? By pushing on the Slido button that you can see on the bottom of the screen. The system allows you to type your question into the text box anytime during our session. And now it's time to listen to Fabrizio Natale. Fabrizio, you are leading a group of researchers at the Knowledge Center for Migration and Demography, and you have recently published an important study. What are the latest scientific evidence on climate-induced displacement?
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon to all the panelists and to the many people which are attending online. I will give you very few highlights from this study, which was published yesterday. And it is a study about climate change-induced migration. Next slide, please. So we started our study with the idea of quantifying how many migrants we could expect in a long-term perspective due to climate change. So the focus of the study is really on long-term processes, not short-term displacement. But gradually, when we were progressing with the study, we quite soon realized that this is probably not the most important question. Before arriving to this point, to quantify climate-induced migration, we need to understand what are the effects in terms of exposure and vulnerability of populations. And this is something that is contrasting the mostly Eurocentric narrative of the mass exodus that we should expect from climate change. And these research efforts, which moved from quantification of climate change migrants to exposure and vulnerability, is also accompanied by an evolution of EU policies in this respect. So next slide, please. In our study, we covered the past, the future, and we have a chapter on the individual perception on migration in Africa. When we speak about the future, the scientific community is using scenarios to make projections. And we use two sets of scenarios. Some scenarios are about emissions and climate change consequences linked to these emissions, and we in particular consider the impacts in terms of agricultural productivity. On the side of the socioeconomic scenarios, we have a series of stories that are translated into quantitative estimates of population, level of income in countries, distribution of population in the territories. It's important to understand that when we want to see the exposure and vulnerability from climate change, we need to work in a geographical context. So the impacts from climate change are localized in space. So it's very important to use highly resolution data and to see these effects in a geographical context. By overlaying the results of these two sets of scenarios, which are translated into quantitative projections, we can estimate how many people will be exposed. And we introduce also the concept of vulnerability, which we define in terms of people in rural areas, in low level of income, and in low level of education. So by overlaying these two sets of scenarios, we can see how many will be exposed and vulnerable to climate change. These people will need to adapt in some way, and migration is just one of the way for adaptation, probably the most extreme one. Next slide, please. So these are an example of the results in our analysis. You see on the horizontal line the socioeconomic pathways, the stories about the future from a socioeconomic perspective, and with the two different symbols, the stories about emissions scenarios. And the numbers that you see there are the number of exposed populations stemming from the combination of these two sets of scenarios for the different parts in Africa and in some continents. So we see that from switching from an RCP 2.6 scenario, which is in line with the Paris Agreement, we have an increase of the exposed population, which in some part of Africa would reach, for example, 16% of the total population. So the effect of these scenarios in climate change can be quantified from the movement from about 8% of exposed population to 16%. So here, the role of socioeconomic scenarios is not very evident. But if we move to the next slide, please, and we start considering different stories about socioeconomic pathways, and we start to look at the effect in terms of vulnerability, and here you see the share of exposed population with low education, we see that there is a very strong effect on what we think the future will be in terms of socioeconomic developments. From the most optimistic storyline to the most pessimistic, we have a strong increase in the share of vulnerable population. So this is just not a theoretical exercise, is showing the importance of combining policies on climate, policies on socioeconomic development, when we speak about impacts from climate change on human systems. Next slide, please. In another part of our report, we have tried to address this link between climate change and exposure and vulnerability, looking at the past. In this case, we overlay data from climate change impacts with data on net migration. Net migration is the movement in population that we see in each cell at very high spatial resolution. And we tried to see if there is a statistical relation between these two components. We couldn't find actually a very strong relation that can be applied to the entire African continent and in a very clear way to a single climate variable. We rather find a patchwork of signals which can be referred to specific areas and to specific indicators. For example, we can see very clearly an effect of climate in the Sahel region. But we see also that climate effects are very much overlapping with the urbanization processes and with conflicts. So we have a case studies in our report dealing with Sudan and South Sudan. Next slide, please. So we could not complete our exercise without looking at the individual perception of people. So this is, we are looking here in the slides that I was showing before at quantitative estimates stemming from satellites, population estimates, demographic aspects, and so on. But at the end, it is the perception of people which will determine their choice for migration. So we consulted the Afrobarometer, and we looked at the questions about the intention to migrate, the perception on climate change, and we tried to see what are the people thinking in Africa about these aspects. So you see that when we speak about the question if climate change is affecting the livelihood in your country, almost 50% of the respondents are saying that yes, there is a negative effect in their countries. And we see also that around 36–37% of the population are expressing the willingness to migrate. When we combine to these two, we try to see among those that want to migrate, which are the ones that link to this decision to migrate to climate change. And we have seen that this linkage is mostly present in population which are living in urban areas, have a higher level of education, and are not inactive. So this is to conclude that among all the big numbers that we have seen in terms of exposure and vulnerability, there is the likelihood that very few people will actually think to migrate internationally due to climate change. So these big numbers do not necessarily translate into migratory flows. Next slide, please. So here are the key messages that I want to leave from my presentation. Exposed population is affected by climate scenarios, but socioeconomic scenarios have a fundamental role when we speak of vulnerability. The population in condition of vulnerability are also the ones that are less likely to consider migration, international migration, as an extreme adaptation strategy. We were not able to find a clear link in this long-term perspective and demographic perspective between climate change and population redistributions. And we see that many times these effects are masked and overlapping with urbanization and conflicts. And I think this conclusion highlights the importance of orienting the policy debates, not necessarily from an incoming exodus, but also to the needs for adaptation of vulnerable population, especially those in rural areas with low education and poverty, which maybe will be suffering the impacts of climate change and not having migration as a viable adaptation strategy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Our second speaker, Sophie von Leuben, is a scientist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Sophie, what kind of result came up from your studies on climate risk in the Sahel region?
Yes, thank you very much, Claudio, for the questions. I'm honored to be here today, and also a warm welcome from Potsdam. I will be presenting the latest research findings of climate impacts in the Sahel, conducted by my colleagues and me here at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research under the coordination of Professor Gornert and Dr. Finke. Next slide, please. So the study we conducted as part of the Sahel Predictive Analytics Project, which is a project led by UNHCR, so the UN Refugee Agency, in support of the United Nations Integrated Strategy for the Sahel, basically to promote evidence-based anticipatory planning in the Sahel of the UN. So we specifically looked at the countries targeted by the UNIS that are listed here. And while we of course recognize that there's various different local contexts and realities of people within the region, the Sahel, and it's been mentioned now several times before, is definitely an important region to look at and very interesting when we assess the interlinkages between climate change, agriculture, and displacement, because of the interconnected risks that we can already see that are already present there, such as population growth, insecurity, displacement, and also the fact that the Sahel is one of the ecosystems that are the most sensitive to climatic changes. Next slide, please. So what we did is, based on global climate models, look at how various climate variables change under different climate change scenarios, and then what the impacts are on key sectors in the region. Next slide. So starting with temperature, on the left here, we used the year 2000 as a reference year. And then going from left to right, you can see how the climate is projected to change in the years 2030, 2050, and 2080. And you also see that, similar to Fabrizio, we looked at two climate scenarios. So the top row shows the climate, how the climate is projected to change with an ambitious climate policy. So more or less if we would manage to stick to the Paris Agreement. And then the bottom row shows the scenario if we don't change anything. So if we continue with business as usual. And it's easy to see here that the temperatures are projected to increase, in particular by the end of the century in the scenario without an ambitious climate policy. So more specifically, projections are between 2 to 4.3 degrees Celsius by 2080, which you can see in the right lower map. One thing I would also like to highlight here is that we found that the number of days with extreme heat are also very, very much going to increase, which is particularly relevant to people working outside. So people working on the fields, people working on agriculture for pastoralists, because it leads to lower productivity of agricultural workforce, but also of livestock, and then also, of course, to health issues. Next slide, please. So the amount of heavy precipitation is also projected to increase, which you see here with the green color on the right side. But with precipitation, the effects vary much more according to the location. So when you zoom into the single regions within the Sahel, you can see that, for example, in northern Chad, there's an expected increase in heavy precipitation events by 2080, while in, for example, the Western Sahel, the number of extreme rainfall events are expected to decrease. And both temperature and precipitation have an effect on water availability, of course, which then in turn has effects on many of the key sectors and livelihood activities that are so relevant in the region. Next slide, please. So we also looked at how those changes will impact key sectors in the region. And I don't have the time now to go into all of the various sectors and into detail, but of course I would also like to highlight the impacts on agricultural production today. Next slide, please. Which is, of course, particularly important because most of the countries in the Sahel are agricultural economies, in which household resources and the ability to feed your family in the end depends on weather conditions. So here we projected the impact of climate change on two very important staple crops in Western Africa, sorghum and millet. And what you can see here is also a decline on the right-hand side, marked with the brownish color, and which is specifically in the areas where currently crops are grown. So you'll have an overall decline in crop yields, which then, next slide, please, already brings us to the aspect of food and nutrition security, and then therefore also displacement. Because as climate change is decreasing water availability and crop production in the Sahel, migration trends are changing and people are migrating more frequently into further destinations. Again, something particularly important to highlight in the Sahel, because populations in many of the Saharan countries, especially populations dependent on agriculture, are historically mobile. So migration is considered as a core element of adaptation, but whether migration is actually a beneficial adaptation strategy very much depends on a variety of factors, such as income, health, and well-being after the people have migrated, especially when migration happens not out of choice. So what I would just sort of highlight as a final conclusion to my presentation is that this kind of scientific evidence that I just showed, that we did here at PIC, but also what Fabrizio's team has done, can and also should inform adaptation planning. And there's definitely a need to invest in long-term adaptation measures, in particular in the agriculture and livestock sectors, to promote resilient livelihoods and also to enhance food and nutrition security, so people in the end can migrate by choice and not out of necessity. Final slide, please. Yeah, so just thank you for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions. All of this information and the study that I was mentioning, both of the studies, are available on the website agrica.de, where you can also find some more country-specific climate risk assessments, and yeah, looking forward to the question and answer round now. Thanks.
Microphone, Claudio.
Sorry,
Start over.
Small problem of microphone. So thanks a lot for your contribution, Sophie. And I just want to remind our audience that you can send your question to our speakers by pushing the slide button that you can see on the bottom of the screen. And the system allows you to type your question into the text box anytime during our session. So let's move to Pretoria now. Angel Dikonge Atangana, you are the Deputy Director for the Regional Bureau, Southern Africa of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The region is at the front line of the climate emergency. How would you describe the situation on the ground?
Thank you, Claudio. Good afternoon to all. My name is effectively Angel Dikonge Atangana, but I represent the High Commissioner for Refugees. I once worked with human rights, but right now I'm speaking for refugees. This first slide, as you can see, is picturing a climate change victim, floods. She has lost everything, and she is precisely saying, I have nothing left, pots, plates, nothing, and she's sitting as she is. Can we go to the next slide? The next slide, please. This slide is showing you the region that I cover, not entirely because not all islands are there, but definitely, as you can see, Most of the countries in the region covered by the Regional Bureau for Southern Africa of UNHCR are affected by climate change. In fact, 7 out of 10 are assessed as being severely impacted. These include Angola, DRC, Madagascar, Mozambique, Republic of Congo, and Zambia and Zimbabwe. I'm actually right now speaking to you from Katanga in the central DRC, where I'm on mission. The statistics that have been displayed thus far can show you that we have a portion of 32% of asylum seeker, 100 plus 100,000, who are precisely affected, part of the caseload that is affected by climate change. We have 668,000 refugees, meaning 87% of the total number of refugees that we cover in this sub-region. 100% of them in DRC and Zimbabwe, and 100% also of the internally displaced persons, 6.4 million altogether. In total, we have 7.6 million, 96% of our persons of concern in this sub-region who are affected by climate change. This is a great proportion, as you can see. And indeed, we have some 500,000 fresh disaster displacements. Next slide, please. You can see the color on the slide. The red is really the severe. Climate-related drivers and crises in our region. Frequent climate-related disaster are in the form of droughts and high temperatures in Madagascar, notably Mozambique, leading to the loss of crops and livestock and severe food crisis. Heavy rainfall and floods in Mozambique, Madagascar, the DRC, Republic of Congo are also a portion for this climate change manifestation. Thirdly, you have tropical cyclone impacting Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, and to a great extent also Malawi, especially if you recall Idai and Kenneth in 2019 with just 6 weeks in between the two very severe cyclones. The compounded risk to populations exposed to both armed conflict and natural hazards, or actually climate change, are really severe in the DRC, where I'm sitting right now, and Mozambique notably. 6 out of the 7 countries are actually assessed to be among the lowest national development gain values of 20%, while only Zambia is around 30% of the same indicator. Next slide, please. The humanitarian and displacement consequences. Indeed, this is really something we are witnessing on a daily basis. Slow onset disasters are very active in Madagascar, where you have 1.5 million people affected by emergency level flood, food crisis, following consecutive droughts, internal displacement in search of food and work. Angola has 1.3 million affected by drought, generating internal displacement of approximately 60,000 people, with 10,000 crossing the border to Namibia, notably. In Madagascar, and we have rapid onset disasters that has, in fact, temporarily displaced 4,300 persons and 2 killed after the adverse impact of tropical cyclone in December 2020 and in February this year. Zimbabwe, I mentioned the 60,000 displaced also previously. Mozambique, you have 160,000 persons who are currently displaced as a result of disaster, climate change related. And you have 2.3 million persons affected altogether. Next slide. All in all, we as UNHCR, what are we doing? What are we trying to do to also not simply witness the impact of these this matter on our persons of concern. We have a strategic orientation and action plan for risk monitoring of climate change induced displacement with 3 pillars. The first pillar is really concentrating on law and policy, including guidance for the interpretation and application of relevant legal and policy frameworks to develop guidance and catalyze regional and international discussions. The pillar 2 is really the most developed one, with 3 subsets, with a first objective to preserve and rehabilitate the natural environment and mitigate environmental degradation in displacement settings. The second subset objective being to enhance the resilience of the displaced population and their host to climate-related and other environmental risks and invest in communication and community engagement. Lastly, we aim to strengthen the preparedness and anticipatory action and response to support protection and solutions for the people who are displaced as well as their host due to disaster situation. And the third pillar is really about UNHCR's environmental footprint, whereby we are striving to indeed green the blue as per the mantra from the Secretary General, and we are doing quite a lot in this regard. Next, please. Then the next slide is actually saying thank you, but I, for some reason, failed to include my 4 key messages following this presentation. I can share them with you right after. I have 4 key messages. The first one is really to say that this region of Southern Africa is at the front line of the climate emergency, even if it didn't come in the different researches that came up. I heard a lot about Sahel, but definitely you may have to look at Southern Africa increasingly, with 7 out of 10 countries ranked as most vulnerable to climate change and least ready to adapt to it. The second point is really 7.6 million persons who are indeed in countries that are most affected by climate change. This, as I told you, is 96% of our caseload in this sub-region. The third message is really about the impacts of slow and rapid onset disasters that are disrupting livelihoods, aggravating poverty, and are driving food insecurity and indeed forced displacement. Lastly, what also we have witnessed is that UNHCR is indeed, what we are doing is we are indeed developing some action orientation in view of combating or making our persons of concern more ready or more resilient to climate change, which I showed you previously. I would like to stop here and would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angel, for your detailed report. Let's find out more now on the phenomenon of disaster displacement. What are the risks and the potential solution for people forced to flee? I give the floor for this to Bina Desai, Head of Programs at the International Displacement Monitoring Center.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Let me thank you also and the organizers for really putting together this session. It's nice to see that in all our contributions and presentations come together, because it's really about the role and the unpacking of the science that Fabrizio and Sophie presented. Really, I think to also bust a few of the myths that are still going around, because these myths about mass migration, for example, that Fabrizio mentioned, have serious implications for indeed policy and planning and the focus that we put within the EU, but also beyond on policies and across the world. So I will focus indeed on disaster displacement as a specific phenomenon. If we can take the next slide, and you will need to click through 4 or 5 times till you also get to the blue, please. Just to show you what we're doing here, you can stop at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. We've been monitoring internal displacement, as our name says, for more than 20 years, starting with the orange countries, which depicted conflict-related displacement, and then since 2008, looking at disaster displacement as well. And as you can see, it's a truly global phenomenon. Every year, we report on more than 20, usually almost 25 million incidents of displacements, so new displacements, incidents where people are forced to flee in the context of disasters across the world. In 2020, for example, it was more than 30 million, 30.7 million, of which the vast majority is weather related, so droughts, floods, cyclones, storms. And most of these, or many of these, have the potential at least to be therefore also impacted, shaped by, and changed over time by climate change. So if we go to the next slide, what's important though, regardless from what we've seen also of Fabrizio's presentation, but also from what we've heard from Angele, is to really go beyond just the focus on climate and the link to what it does to hazard. We've over the years monitored an increasing number of these displacements in both disasters and conflict contexts, and increasingly in contexts where the drivers of both come together, converge and compound. And Angela, you were saying you're in the DRC, we can see there that big orange circle in the middle of the map, and a really high purple, dark purple color, which depicts climate vulnerability as assessed by the ND Gain Index. So increasingly, we see also conflict-related displacement occurring in countries that are vulnerable to climate change impacts. And this, of course, means that we need to go, as also Sophie was saying, and both were all the others were saying, go beyond, therefore, the hazard focus and look at exposure and vulnerability. If we go to the next slide, please. This is really, what we've done at IDMC with our global displacement risk model. None of this will be news to those people who've been looking at disaster risk more broadly, but we have to look at the people exposed, but also the buildings when we think about displacement, their homes, and particular vulnerability. And in doing so, the global phenomenon that we've seen in terms of trying to identify the hotspots is of course driven by, as Fabrizio again also said, highly localized and geographically specific contexts. If we go to the next slide, and maybe I'll skip this in the interest of time because Sophie much more eloquently talked about, and Fabrizio as well, about the different scientific processes behind this. So here we have just emissions rates, again, emission scenarios and socioeconomic pathway scenarios on how they drive displacement risk. But if we go to the next slide, please, this is where I wanted to get at. It's really about how, if we look at the phenomenon at a global scale, how we see that there is, on the one hand, absolute risk increases, risk of displacement in the Asia-Pacific region. But this year, what I wanted to show you is relative to population size. And that's where we see particular risk in small and island development states. And I wanted to pull this out as compared to some of the other analysis that has been already provided, and that was focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, to hone in, for example, on the Pacific. We also see in the Caribbean, of course, that there's high levels of risk for climate or disaster-related displacement. But in the Pacific region, this has been recognized, of course, as a key issue for quite a while now. And there are a number of things we can do about this. So indeed, we need to now move beyond just identifying the phenomenon and the problems, and really come together in looking at some of the solutions. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk a lot about it, but what is clear is what is needed is a stronger documentation of what is already being done. So it's great to see what Angela has presented in terms of some of the focus areas that UNHCR has been identifying in Southern Africa. But if we go to the next slide, there are two dimensions where the role of science really is critical, we believe, and where more focus on evidence building, risk assessments, and also just really solid data collection can contribute. One is on short-term and not short-term, let's say improved response and preparedness. And it is relatively short-term, but it also requires long-term investments. And the other is on long-term planning, which was also already mentioned. And for improving responses, what we can do with the types of risk models that have been presented here earlier, which may seem rather scientific, they can actually have real-time and very operationally relevant applications. So, for example, for almost real-time early warning systems to inform humanitarian action, where some of the climate hotspots where you would apply risk assessments to those types of areas at a more granular scale, and then run them against expected early warnings for specific hazards. You can identify what are the expected exposed populations in these areas, and therefore prepare better. If we go to the next slide, more importantly, and the last slide, in addition to that, what is important, of course, is long-term planning. And this is in the context of the Pacific region, something that we've been lucky to be able to invest in over a number of years in a consortium with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and the Platform for Disaster Displacement, PDD, to support countries and really taking the type of risk information that Fabrizio, Sophie, and others are working on, and the type of displacement risk models that IDMC has developed, and apply and take that really into policy development at a regional scale, as well as into operational planning and disaster response at a national scale for each of those Pacific Island countries. And I will just end on this. We really see a unique opportunity right now to take the phenomenon of displacement in the context of climate change and disasters now into new conversations that are happening at the international level on internal displacement, in the follow-up of a high-level panel that the Secretary General had put together on internal displacement, which is focusing a lot on conflict, but also has in its mandate, in a sense, disaster displacement and climate impacts. So this is an opportunity at the global level, but there's also a huge appetite, we believe, at the national level for countries that are at the front line, the ones that Ankele mentioned, but also the ones in the Pacific region, for example, to really take the lead now on addressing the topic. So I really look forward to seeing how more of the science that we've been hearing about here today can be used for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina. And after this last presentation, we have now a quick round of question and answer. The first one is for Sophie. So were you able to estimate how many people will be displaced by climate change in future in Africa, and which are the most impacted regions?
Thanks, Claudio. I think this question will be taken over by Fabrizio.
Yes, I can answer to that question.
Yes. Sorry for the mistake.
No problem. Yes, this is actually what we did in the report, quantified the exposure and vulnerability in the different parts of Africa, but even going lower at the more granular level, we can zoom in at the level of cells of 50 kilometers, square kilometers. And the most exposed region in terms of absolute numbers is Western Africa. In relative terms is Northern Africa. But when it comes to vulnerability, we see systematically across the three dimensions that we consider that Western Africa would be more vulnerable in the sense that we have higher share of population exposed in rural areas, in low level of incomes and low level of education. This is according to the worst socioeconomic scenarios.
Okay, thank you very much. And now the question for Sophie. So it's, sorry, I had to search for the question. So is climate change altering migration partners in general, and how?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I think in general, it's important to say that climate and weather has always been a migration driver, but of course now with climate extremes becoming more frequent and more extreme in their impact, that has an impact on migration. And that's also what we've heard from Angel, what she reported from her work in Southern Africa. I think in the Sahel, it's an interesting location to look at, because you have a big pastoralist system there, where because most of the Sahel is too dry to allow livestock herders to be sedentary, and they've always adapted by moving the herds according to the availability of water and pasture land. But as that is changing as well, existing migration trends are altering in a way that they become more frequent, and that people also have to migrate to further destinations. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have heard the voices of science and humanitarian organization. Now let's see the policy response. Cecilia Jimenez de Mari is a special rapporteur of the human rights of internally displaced person at Human Rights Council. Cecilia, considering the slow onset effect of climate change on internal displacement, what's your analysis of the enjoyment of human rights by this group of people?
Thank you very much, Claudio, for giving me the floor. Thank you for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. Indeed, the slow onset effects on internal displacement are actually very large, and that was the topic of my report to the United Nations General Assembly in 2020. Human mobility linked to the adverse effects of climate change, including displacement, as we all know, is expected to increase significantly over the coming years and decades. Most displaced persons are expected to remain within national borders. The impacts of displacement on the enjoyment of human rights are extensive, affecting people's rights to freedom of movement, housing, food, water and sanitation, healthcare and education, as well as their cultural and religious rights, and just among others. The scope of my report to the General Assembly is focused on internal displacement and the slow onset adverse effects of climate change. And I made it in order to increase the attention to the so-called less dramatic effects, but that over time have tremendous effects, including internal displacement on the daily lives and futures of affected populations. Among the examples are rising sea levels, drought, the melting of glaciers, and desertification. Now, under international law, the guiding principles on internal displacement clearly stipulate that disasters may be a cause of internal displacement, and therefore human rights apply. Moreover, slow onset adverse effects of climate change can turn into disasters. The guiding principles likewise provide that internally displaced persons may be persons who are obliged and may not necessarily be forced to leave their homes, and therefore they are internally displaced. Indeed, human mobility in the context of slow onset processes can take many forms, including displacement, migration, and even planned relocation that many states are undertaking. In most cases, movement is not entirely voluntary or forced, but rather falls somewhere on a continuum between the two, with different degrees of voluntariness and constraint. In many cases, movement can be an effective adaptation strategy and actually prevent arbitrary displacement. People are displaced, however, and this I would like to emphasize, when they are obliged to leave because they can no longer adapt to the changing climate. They have no option other than to leave when, for example, an area has become uninhabitable or too dangerous for human habitation. And therefore, we cannot even talk about the settlement option under durable solutions of returning. Slow onset processes can also compound other displacement drivers, such as intercommunal tensions, violence, and armed conflict. The intersecting risks of climate change and armed conflict, I have found, heighten the vulnerability of people and communities and actually undermine their adaptive capacity, increasing the risk of displacement. So, Internal displacement in the context of slow onset processes poses particular challenges and needs increased attention, particularly on the human rights of the people themselves. And while climate change is global, its adverse effects and related mobility affect people differently. For example, communities living in certain areas, such as low-lying coastal areas, small island states, and Arctic ecosystems are more exposed to slow onset events and therefore are at higher risk of disaster displacement. People whose livelihoods depend heavily on ecosystems, such as indigenous peoples, farmers, herders, pastoralists, fisherfolk, are affected more directly and at higher risk of displacement. Slow onset processes and related displacement also intersect with gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, cultural background, and disability, resulting in differentiated impacts on different groups and exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. It is therefore, however, important to also acknowledge not only their vulnerability, but acknowledge the great agency of these groups. In many contexts, they display remarkable strength, resourcefulness, and resilience in the face of disasters and displacement, despite the challenges, barriers, and discrimination that they face. They also have traditional knowledge and valuable perspectives that can contribute to the design of programmatic and policy responses, disaster risk reduction strategies, and durable solutions. Affected communities in all their diversity must be an integral part of response and solutions to internal displacement. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 crisis has increased such vulnerability, while climate change increases frequency and intensity of natural hazards, together resulting in a higher risk of disaster and displacement. And therefore, climate action undertaken in respect for human rights is essential to prevention, protection, and solutions for internal displacement. Climate action cannot wait longer. We know this. This is one reason why we, in the Interagency Standing Committee, we issued a collective statement just last week where we urge governments to take certain policy and programmatic measures, among which are, 1, ensure a focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized people in crisis, with a particular focus on women, youth, internally displaced, and refugees. Second, listen to the communities and grassroots leaders, particularly women, youth, and indigenous peoples, and engage them in decision-making and co-creating and owning solutions that put people, climate, and nature at the center of all action, with human rights underlying that. Yesterday, I was part of a webinar, and certain internally displaced women leaders were saying, this is enough of storytelling on what we are going through. We would like to be a part of the solution and not just tell you what's going on with our lives. Third, is also a recommendation by the IASC that governments should invest in more effective preventative risk management and capacities at the local level, including climate risk monitoring and early warning and early action. Fourth, increase financing for climate adaptation action that targets the most vulnerable countries and communities. And last but not the least, turn global commitments into effective local action that empowers those most at risk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your contribution, Cecilia. It's time now to hear the voice of Europe on these topics. I give the floor to Chiara Adamo, Acting Director for Human Development, Migration, Governance and Peace Director in DG International Cooperation Development in the European Commission. Please.
Thank you. My fellow speakers have eloquently laid out the available research, facts, and also thanks to the special rapporteur, in particular, some of the policy approaches and solutions that I was about to present. So I hope this will allow me to be briefer. But The evidence is, of course, there. Climate change has a clear impact on people's lives, on their human rights, including in terms of forced displacement. And the work of organizations such as those organizing and participating in the conference today show that there is a gradual realization of the link between climate change and human mobility. However, despite the fact that the attention is increasing, it is still only modestly incorporated in policies and in long-term solutions. So there is a need to mobilize the international community to do more. The European Union will have this opportunity next year. We will have the chairmanship of the Platform on Disaster Displacement from July 2022 for 18 months. And we think it's an important opportunity to work and join efforts in this direction together with all other members, including the current chair, Fiji, several member states of the European Union, such as France and Germany. So we really want to make our chairmanship an occasion for mobilizing. And why is it so important for us to mobilize? Because simply this issue is at the intersection of key EU priorities. It's about fighting climate change. It's about promoting sustainable development, sustained peace, and addressing migration challenges. So in this context, it is really important to work across policy silos, as we heard, and not just be content by managing the disasters and displacements. So the response must be evidence-based, and we heard our colleagues, it needs to be policy-driven and very much human rights-based and supported by adequate resources. In terms of the policy response, I wanted to make 3 points. The first is that climate-induced displacement, and we heard it from most of the speakers, is essentially or mainly an issue of internal displacement, more than a cross-border problem. So internally displaced persons need specific protection and assistance following disasters and the adverse effect of climate change. So it is our responsibility as European Union, as member states, but also as international community of all our partners at the UN level who committed to the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs to support partner countries who are mostly affected. And this support must be strengthened. The second point was underlined by the OECHR rapporteur. The leaving no one behind and the addressing of the inequalities must be key to solve the issue. Climate change affects people differently, depending on a number of factors. The gender factor was mentioned. Women are often the hardest hit. And the EU is really determined to work to protect women from environmental degradation and climate change, particularly in the context of fragile situations. And this is very much the priority in the context of our latest EU Gender Action Plan running until 2025. Third and last, it is crucial to involve those affected by disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation in the national and local response planning and implementation. I mentioned women. I would also like to put the spotlight on the young people who are most likely to move in this context in response to climate-related shocks. And we need to promote that really they can participate in decision-making processes. We can have their voice heard in planning, but also in the implementation of responsive measures. And on that, I'd like to announce that next year we will come up with a youth action plan, which will also have an important element of that. Finally, I mean, disaster and climate-related displacement needs to be addressed throughout the 360-degree approach. So it's about prevention, preparedness, helping people who are in the move, and strengthening resilience. And one of the speakers mentioned the need to put means and credible means to solve this. We are supporting a number of efforts in all these areas. One example was illustrated by IDMC for the Pacific response to disaster displacement. But we need to do more. And for the future, the European Union has set two important targets. 35% of all our external funds will be allocated to climate action, and 10% to support management and governance of migration and forced displacement, including to address the root causes. So we believe that this should significantly more impact on helping the vulnerable populations and forced displaced peoples in this context. So I thank you for this. I'm sorry I was running because I was aware that to be the last speaker, I did want to leave a few minutes. Thank you.
Not easy, Chiara, but you did it very well. Thank you very much for this important message. So we are at the end of this very interesting debate. We got a lot of questions. So this is a message for our audience. Our speakers will stay here for answering your question in the chat event. So keep on watching the chat event. Our speaker will answer your question. So we are really at the end of this very interesting debate. Thanks to our guests for your outstanding contribution, and many thanks to our viewers for watching. Have a nice day.